Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And these are going to be a super 60 minutes. I mean, this is going to be one of the best 60 minutes you've spent in a long time. Now, I know many of you are distracted by what's happening in the House of Commons just now, and I can understand why that is. But you might want to record this, or you might want to record what's happening at Westminster. Your choice. Again, thanks to you, the TNT Show and India Live are producing more and more exciting shows. And this is at a time, by the way, when the BBC is cutting back on its Scottish content. So you can watch the TNT Show, for example, at indialive.net. It's streamed out on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus on YouTube, you can watch all the previous 150 odd shows. So if you're upset by media coverage of political events, where journalism is often junked in favour of stenography or rehashed news releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. Please be here for us by supporting the crowdfunder. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Supporters of the unwritten and certainly uncodified Constitution point to the essential role of conventions in upholding the integrity of the political system in the UK. Despite this, the Speaker today has set a new rule. Many people would argue that conventions are worthless if these can be junked at a moment's notice. Or breaking news. If you haven't already come across this, in the last hour, the SNP group has walked out of the Commons. Tonight, we'll be talking to another excellent guest, Arthur Snell. Arthur is joining us from Cheltenham, and among the subjects we'll be covering is British foreign policy and his book, How Britain Broke the World. You'll get it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. So I'm looking forward to the show enormously, and I hope you're going to enjoy it as much as I am anticipating. You'll be taking your questions live, and there's still time to get your question considered. You'll find the details on the screen. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So unlike the BBC, no license, no problem. Now to our guest, Arthur Snell. Welcome, Arthur.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. I've been looking forward to speaking with you for many, many months. I'm so glad we're able to do this tonight. Now, Arthur, you've written this book, How Britain Broke the World, and we'll be delving into much of that tonight. But if you could, and this is always an impossible task, but let me ask you anyway, if you could paraphrase in a couple of 3 minutes what the book is about. We've put the book on the screen just now. Tell us in your own words, what prompted you, and what is the book about?
Sure. Well, thank you, John. I'll start with what prompted me, because it probably helps explain the content. I worked as a diplomat in the period just before the millennium. So I actually joined the Foreign Office in 1998, and I did that work up until 2014, and in that period, I saw a sort of degradation of Britain's foreign policy and also its effectiveness on the world stage. And of course, that was a process that carried on. 2014 will be an important date for many Scottish people. 2016, of course, the Brexit vote. And you could argue that we've sort of continued in a certain direction. So I wanted to try to write a history of Britain's foreign policy in the modern era. And I started in 97. Obviously, that's when the Blair government begins, and followed it up to 2022, which, of course, is a very important moment in international affairs with the invasion of Ukraine. So it's a sort of quarter century where quite a lot of important and interesting things happened. And notably for UK politics, of course, the Iraq War, the aftermath of the events of 9/11, and then moving onwards, as I mentioned, of course, eventually the events of Brexit. So this is a book that looks at British foreign policy and the effect that it has had on the wider world. And I suppose my argument, very briefly, is that whilst Britain is not the country it once was, it's certainly not a global empire. It's, we're a very different country to where we were maybe 100 years ago. But we still have the capacity to be quite influential. And in my view, we've often ended up using that influence, sadly, to a negative effect.
You've got, when I dip into the book here, you've got some fantastic sound bites here. Let me just read one of them. On page 15, you say its foreign policy is constantly shaped by imperial hubris, the strange belief that Britain knows best, that it can dispense wisdom and guidance, often forcefully, around the world, when recent actions should give it pause for thought. This book seeks to learn the lessons from the cracked world we live in and explain Britain's role in breaking it. And you go on to say, you mentioned the financial services and all of that good stuff. But your contention is that Britain's foreign policy has been guided by an underlying theme, a misplaced British belief that it has a better understanding of what is good for most people outside Britain than those people who actually have themselves. Do you still hold to that, Arthur?
Yes, definitely. And it's something I saw when I was working as a diplomat. There was almost this assumption that obviously, like I say, we're in a post-imperial age, so Britain doesn't anymore seek literally to control other countries, but it's almost we view our post-imperial job as to tell other countries the right way to run their countries. And of course, in some cases, it does involve literal control. So we participated in the invasion of Iraq, and I write quite a lot actually in my book about the role of the British intelligence around WMD, which of course proved to be incorrect, without which it may not have been possible to have justified that invasion, and it might have actually not even been possible for the US to push forward with the invasion. But going back to your point about this kind of rather sort of preachy approach, where I've noticed it in almost every country I worked in as a diplomat, that we look at other countries and then we sort of start saying, well, here's why you should you should follow Britain's example. And just to take a small case study, which wasn't in my book, I worked at one point in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a fairly small country in the Caribbean. It's not terribly well known that it's not really a sort of tourism based economy like a lot of other countries in the region. It has more of a oil and gas sort of energy, offshore oil and gas. And in that regard, I remember once sort of getting instructions that we were going to start telling the people of, the government of Trinidad and Tobago about how great the PFI, Public Finance Initiative, was in the UK. Now, of course, anyone who's lived in the UK for the last 20 years will know that this is a notorious scheme where private businesses build hospitals and other public infrastructure and then lease them back to the state at great profit to themselves, at great expense to us, the taxpayer, and usually offering very poor service and and other aspects. So the idea that we would then go around the world sort of extolling the virtues of this system seems pretty quaint to me. But that's an example, I think, of how Britain sees its role. And of course, we're not just doing this because we believe in some sort of ideological thing that PFI is brilliant. I mean, there may be part of that, but part of it is because we see it as a way to make money for our businesses, our advisors, our lawyers, our accountants, and so on. Because of course, these schemes are very complicated and require a lot of administration and regulation and so on. So I think that's just one example on quite a small scale of how Britain seems to think that it has the answers and other people might want our answers without actually engaging in the self-examination. We should perhaps be asking ourselves, why do we have PFI schools where the school ends up paying a contractor hundreds of pounds to cut the grass or something crazy like that?
Yeah, it does seem to be very odd, doesn't it? I mean, you give lots of examples in your book. You talk with enormous feeling and integrity about Kosovo as well as Iraq. You touch upon the business in Libya. I mean, the cynics, well, maybe not the cynics, but some people I've read say foreign policy is not about ethics. It's about making money. It's about, is it possible to have an ethical foreign policy?
Well, it's a great question. And actually, as you'll know, John, I sort of started the book in 97, and some people will remember Robin Cook, of course, the first foreign secretary under the new Labour government at that time, giving a speech where he was he was at least quoted as having said that we needed an ethical foreign policy. And in fact, to be fair, what he said very specifically was there was an ethical dimension, which is not quite the same thing. But clearly he was trying to bring this concept of ethics. I think it's reasonable for any country to try to hold its values when it pursues foreign policy. But of course, countries have interests, and an independent Scotland may find itself needing to do trade deals with Saudi Arabia, or whatever. There will always be difficult questions that any country has to make. So my book is not, I don't think, an attempt to try to sort of argue for a slightly unrealistic approach. But I think equally what we have to do is ask ourselves, what are the benefits of a certain approach? So, for example, and I start the book with Kosovo because I think it's quite a good case study in the sense that a lot of people look back at the Kosovo intervention and see it as a really sort of profound moment when Britain stood up for human rights, for the rule of law, for the rights of the Kosovar Albanians. And I'm not against that argument, but I think we also have to understand the wider implications of the intervention in Kosovo. So it has had a destabilizing effect on that region. It remains the case that Kosovo is not recognized by some countries. I mean, some of that is actually comes back to the internal politics of Spain, for example, which again may be very familiar to viewers of this show, given that the analogies perhaps with Scotland, but also the wider results that the use of NATO and the use of force by NATO in Kosovo in 1999 without a UN resolution. Now, why that's important is because it sort of created a platform that enabled a much more serious use of force, ignoring the UN Security Council in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. So that's a great example, to my mind, of an unintended consequence. I wouldn't argue that Blair went into Kosovo in order to pave the way for Iraq. No one foresaw the events of 9/11, of course, but it was this thing of chipping away at the international architecture, the rules-based international system, which again is something we as Britain, I think, have often talked about as being very important to us. But actually, we say it's important, but we're very often the ones breaking the rules and saying, yeah, but the rules are important for everybody else, but for us somehow they don't seem to count.
It's interesting because your quote about Kosovo on page 47, you say, the British idea that a UN Security Council resolution was unnecessary for humanitarian and military action was a radical departure from agreed international norms.
Yeah.
I mean, some people looking at what's happening in Gaza might be thinking, maybe there's a case there for a radical departure from for humanitarian reasons. I mean, if it was appropriate in Kosovo, why is it not appropriate elsewhere? Maybe this is your point. Once you abandon the rules, you leave yourself wide open now.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that there's been a degradation of the authority of the UN Security Council, and you could argue that degradation begins in 1999 with the Kosovo intervention. But the thing about it was that because most people could agree that the underlying intention in Kosovo was a reasonable one, was to protect innocent civilians, so people didn't really see it as a very serious problem. Now with Iraq, it got very different, because obviously with Iraq, it was a hostile invasion of a sovereign state, and again, whatever you think of Saddam Hussein, I personally, I think his record speaks for itself. He was a brutal dictator, but to invade a sovereign state and unseat its government, by most definitions of international law, was illegal, and I think most subsequent analysis bears that out. So you have that degradation, and by the time you then get to the Syria civil war, which devastating civil war, which is hundreds of thousands of casualties and of course millions of refugees and so on. By that point, the UN Security Council has basically broken down, and you have Russia and China blocking any attempts to hold Syria's government to account. And I would want viewers to be clear on this. I'm not saying then that I defend Russia or I agree with Russia's stance. I think Russia was very cynical. It defended Assad's regime in Syria for cynical reasons of its own. But I think that it was made a lot easier for them. We made it easier for them by having already undermined this international system in those earlier years. And so to come all the way to the present day, of course, now on Gaza, the UN looks rather sort of toothless and almost pointless. And of course, Israel is constantly undermining and attacking the UN, and they have a bit of a track record of doing that. And I think that from their perspective, is they say the UN is hostile to them. But of course, it could be argued that, well, the UN is trying to stand up for certain standards that are ones that Israel usually tries not to be held to.
I mean, it is. I mean, what strikes me about foreign policy in particular, I mean, I know that it's always very difficult once you're in office as a politician to keep to the promises that you made while you were grubbing for votes before an election. It's not easy. I mean, I don't want anyone to leave today thinking, oh, gracious, this guy thinks it's easy being a politician. I don't. And I don't think you think that either.
No.
You have to weigh up all sorts of circumstances and possible outcomes. Though I have to say, I'm sometimes rather taken aback by how glib some of the processes are that lead to decisions which have huge ramifications, but seem to be taken quite lightly. I mean, the business of saying to people in public, we're going to junk or leave the European Court of Human Rights, having helped to set it up way back when, strikes me as a bizarre thing to say.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. And it's it's like we didn't learn anything from Brexit, because we went down that particular tunnel without a clear understanding of the ramifications. And I write about this in the book because, to my mind, what you've just described there, John, as taking very big and complex decisions with far-reaching consequences on the basis of apparently really quite sort of superficial analysis. Well, that certainly happened in the decision to go with the Americans and the Iraq War. And of course, let's not forget that there's no inevitability around that. The Britons didn't join the Vietnam War. France and Germany didn't join the Iraq War. So there's no certainty that we would have to join the Iraq War. And then, interestingly, David Cameron, one could argue, had an even less sort of consideration when he piled into Libya. Again, saying this is not to defend Gaddafi, another brutal dictator, somebody who I don't mourn in any particular way, but the idea that suddenly let's just remove the Gaddafi regime in Libya and democracy will flourish. Well, it's not what's happened. Libya is basically a failed state now. And so those to me were good examples of the way Britain approached very far-reaching major foreign policy decisions. And of course, Brexit is another far-reaching major foreign policy decision. Now, you could say, well, we had a referendum and there was a debate and that, all the issues were discussed then. But I mean, I think most people would not see it that way. I think it was pretty clear that the referendum did not give people a very clear idea of what was coming down the line, and the many of the things that are now painfully obvious about lack of access to Europe, whether it's for individuals or for our goods and services and so on. We were repeatedly told by the Brexit supporters that wasn't ever going to be an issue, and that's Project Fear and all this stuff. So again, it is quite extraordinary in a way that you could have that campaign, and in fact, as has emerged subsequently, David Cameron forbade civil servants from preparing for losing the referendum. I mean, imagine that we were taking this major constitutional decision on a deliberate plan where we didn't make a plan. I mean, it's just extraordinary that a country of this sort of size and history and the size of our economy, and it's not me being aggrandizing, it's just to look at the numbers, that we could have done something so with so little preparation, really.
I mean, it is extraordinary. Do you think it's possible, assuming given the best of circumstances, do you think it's possible to make Brexit work?
I mean, my personal view is no. I mean, I suppose what you could say is if you made a very, very minimal Brexit with sort of Norway style, to use the cliche. So you remain in both the single market and the customs union, or a version, something like that. I think that could work. And then of course you might have arguments about what's the point. I mean, I think I probably, like many people, in the immediate aftermath of the vote, I voted Remain. That's probably no secret. That people like me I was very upset about the result, but I thought, well, it's a narrow margin, 52-48, and therefore, if you're going to do this, then you should do it in a way that is a sort of narrow Brexit. And you don't say this is a massive, clear mandate. And obviously, as you will know better than I do, Scotland did not vote for Brexit, Northern Ireland did not vote for it. So you didn't have a majority of the nations. You certainly didn't have an overwhelming majority. You didn't have a 2/3 majority. Various thresholds were not reached. You didn't have a majority of registered voters. Another important point. So I had always thought that could be done, and you would end up in a scenario where, some people would say, well, this isn't proper Brexit, but most people I would have thought would have said, look, you're no longer in the EU. You no longer have all that stuff in Brussels. You no longer have to be in sort of that gravy train, but you still have a lot of advantages, and maybe that would have allowed the sort of passion to die down a little. But equally, it may have been that the Brexit sort of movement is something that it is sort of constantly claiming to have been betrayed. Even now there are people who sort of argue that the reason that Brexit hasn't worked is because we haven't done it enough. And you think, crikey, and how far can you go? And now we're talking about the ECHR, which has, I'm sure all your viewers very well informed, has nothing to do with the EU, but people think that that's still part of Brexit. So it's a kind of unsustainable, like a sort of beast that is never eaten enough.
It does seem to be very odd indeed. And again, many people are looking at this from Scotland, knowing that Scotland voted to stay. And they're, let me put it this way, as kindly as I can, they're confused by what's happening in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Because they're saying to themselves, well, hold on a second, they also voted to stay. And now they're having all this largesse showered upon them.
And if you're born in Northern Ireland, you have access to an EU passport. You've got freedom of movement. I mean, you have a lot of advantages, and that obviously there are all kinds of historic context there. But if you're born Scottish and you voted Remain, well, tough, So from whatever perspective you look at this, it's very easy to see how the Brexit vote put a lot of, I think, power in the validity of the independence argument. I'm not personally a sort of pro-independence person, but I completely get why Brexit makes that argument a lot more powerful.
In the medium term, it's going to be unsustainable to have the situation in Northern Ireland not be replicated elsewhere. But who knows? I mean, there's lots of unsustainable things happening. I want to come back to specific foreign policy as such. You make a very good point about on page 149. You say, look, while exact figures can be hard to acquire owing to security classification, the overall trend is unambiguous. In the mid-1980s, the UK had 3,000 diplomats posted around the world. By the mid-1990s, this figure had fallen to 2,500. And by 2018, this number was around 1,700. That's the lowest in modern British history. Now, the up-to-date figures might be even smaller for all I know.
They will be, I think,
but you make the point that during the same period, France posted roughly twice as many diplomats abroad. And you could argue from these figures, that this is a deep-seated issue. This is not something that happened because of Brexit. Brexit is merely a symbol.
I agree. Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. And I think people are often surprised to learn that, because the sort of British embassies and the Foreign Office seem like quite grand institutions, but smaller than the French diplomatic service, much smaller than the German, smaller, I think, than the Italian diplomatic service. And it's not just about numbers, of course, but in terms of budgets and other things. And what's strange about this is that, of course, we live in an era of quite considerable public financial stress. That there's always a list of things that governments have to decide what they're going to spend money on. But a diplomatic service is actually a very cheap thing. I mean, again, I understand that people might not expect that because you imagine the sort of fancy buildings in capital cities. But the budget of the Foreign Office is about the same as a sort of large county council in England, somewhere like Kent. So it really is not. It doesn't sort of budge the needle either way in terms of the overall public finances. But of course, the impact of having a really well organized, well staffed foreign service with expertise, and that's another thing I write about in the book, proper expertise, not just someone who's been dropped into one country where they probably haven't got a background, they may not speak the language particularly well, or all those sorts of things. You want people who've maybe spent years learning about certain regions and certain issues. And again, that's something that our Foreign Office has really has reduced its investment in terms of expertise, both in the headquarters, specialist analysts, but also experts who are posted out in the field.
Yeah, you make that point on page 155. You say the idea of an expert cadre considering policy against a wider evidence-based and advising ministers on the best path to take, or offering an informed critique of a proposed policy, simply does not exist in the British system.
Yeah. And it's as one of the things I did as part of my research, because I wanted to make a sort of slightly comparative point, was I looked at the French diplomatic service and I looked at the US. Now, obviously, the US is a much bigger country, and sometimes the way Britain compares itself to the US is a bit ridiculous because they're different categories. But what's interesting is if you look at the State Department, their foreign service, the leadership, the people in the top roles tend to have got doctorates or advanced degrees in the area that they work in, and you'll be able to see that it's very clear. It's on the website. You can look on people's profiles, and quite rightly so, they'll explain where they did their studies and so on. You don't find that on the UK, and so I did a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Office to ask, well, what proportion of the senior staff, and I defined that clearly so it was easy for them to know what I was saying, do have an advanced degree either in a specific region of the world or in international relations or something that's relevant to their work. And the reply I got, which was so informative, was the Foreign Office told me they did not have a reason to hold this information, which is quite extraordinary. So it's not that we don't even care to find out.
Care enough,
yeah. Really strange. And let's not forget, this is the place where Michael Gove said this country's had enough of experts. I mean, it really has, I think, which is I think, it's disappointing.
I want to take a question. I'd like to come back to this, Arthur, if we may, but I'd like to take a question from our audience. Charles Smith asks, does Arthur have a view on a Scottish First Minister having to be shadowed by a UK government representative if meeting with overseas Prime Minister? I guess with any, what is your view on that? Do people need to be babysat?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Charles. And it's funny because when we were talking earlier, John, I suggested I thought this might come up because I know it's been a subject of some interest in Scotland. And for those who might not be familiar with the issue, that basically when Hamza Yousaf or whoever might be First Minister at any given time goes overseas, and of course he's a senior political figure on the world stage. He goes, he has meetings, and the Foreign Office has said that they insist that the UK unionist diplomatic presence must be there to sort of take the note. I mean, I think it feels to me this is one of those arguments where I can see both sides of the argument, because I certainly think that Scotland, I'm not just saying this to be nice to your audience. I think Scotland has a right to be taken seriously on the world stage. It's an important country. It's a historic country. And of course, setting aside the independence question, the First Minister of Scotland is a powerful person representing a significant constituency. So that person should have the right to meet whoever they want. I certainly don't think it is appropriate for them to sort of feel that they need this kind of babysitter sitting by them and sort of perhaps telling them what they can and can't talk about. On the other hand, I think you can see why the Foreign Office would take a strong interest. They'd want to know, not because they're spying, but simply that they want to be part of the discussion. They want to know what the agenda is, what are the issues, and there may be things of interest. It seems to me the best solution to this is a sort of good faith assumption that both sides would keep each other informed. and that, that Hamza Yusuf, for example, would debrief the local embassy and give them a detailed account, or the local embassy would facilitate some of those visits and so on. I think the challenge there is, of course, I said a good faith assumption, and I think particularly under this government, we've seen a very conflictual relationship between Westminster and Holyrood. I think personally, I think that there's no need for that. Even setting aside the constitutional question, it seems to me that you can say very easily, look, we have a different position here, but we respect the dignity of this office. We understand the function of this office, its importance both domestically and internationally, and there's no reason why we can't collaborate sort of like grown-ups. But then, if that had been the case, then I think one of the things that needed to have happened on day one of Brexit was that meeting with the four nations as equal partners. And of course, that was not the way this government decided to approach it. So I think it requires cultural change, and probably more of the cultural change needs to happen in Westminster than it does in Edinburgh, as far as I can tell.
You also make an interesting point on page 354. You're talking about Brexit. You say it's hard to imagine Europe, assuming that anyone at Westminster wanted to rejoin the EU, which sounds like a leap of a leap of imagination. But let's take that leap.
Yeah.
You say it's hard to imagine Europe readily readmitting its troublesome former member, particularly if the question of Scottish independence remains unresolved. Why do you say that?
Well, I think obviously if you're a European country, remember any reapplication from the UK requires unanimous agreement by every single member of the EU. So then you've got the questions which come. There are general questions which are about the UK having been this troublesome former member, the whole Brexit process. You say you're rejoining. It's like the analogy of the the straying partner who says, this time I'm never going to have another affair, and it's the third one or something, and you think, well, I'm sorry, I think there are lots of analogies we can all imagine. So there's that thing. But I think that the independence question is extremely significant because, again, there are clearly countries within Europe who find it quite hard to get their head around the idea of a sort of self-determination of a constituent country. Now, I think one of the positive things we can say about Britain was that we exercised an independence referendum, and it was a civilized debate. And yes, of course, tensions were they go up and down, but it was basically a political event. No one arrested the leaders. It's not like what we saw happening with Catalonia. So I think in that sense, the way we've approached it up to 2014, I think was commendable. Obviously, what's happening now is more complicated. But there are countries in Europe that I think would feel quite uneasy if they felt that Britain was likely to join, and then there was likely to be a new country called Scotland emerging from that. Now, were Britain to have joined, one of the things that would probably need to have been established from the start was Scotland's status as an independent Scotland, in that event in the EU. But then that you get into these very tangled questions, and this is why I think the problem with Brexit is that it's very easy to say, yep, we'll leave, everything's going to be fine and dandy. But even to say now, well, it hasn't worked as we'd expected, we need to explore the ways that we can rejoin. It is very, very complicated. There are a lot of these, knotty issues. Obviously, Scotland's one of them, but there are lots of others where there are questions which, if you were already in, we accept you're a member of this organization. It's like the Gibraltar question, we accept your presence and we manage it. But if you're coming from the outside and saying you've got to take me with all these complications, I think the EU will have a different attitude.
Yeah. What do you think of the way the Foreign Office is handling Gibraltar?
I mean, I'll admit that I think they've got a tricky. It's a sort of sticky wicket, because again, it's a good example of the Brexit challenge that if you're in the EU, of course, Spain's approach to Gibraltar has over the years, it does, it changes with the different government in power, but it's always been on paper, at least, that they don't accept British sovereignty there. But at different times, sometimes Spanish governments have been fairly cooperative. At other times, they've been extremely hostile. The difficulty is, again, once you've left the EU, then you have a very different status. If you travel that causeway into Gibraltar now, you've left the EU, and Spain has. I mean, I know, John, it's a country you know very well, but Spain has any number of border security questions that it has to grapple with, the proximity to Africa and so on. So I can see why they feel that, in Madrid, that they feel that this is very unsatisfactory. Now, I think the Foreign Office's handling of Gibraltar itself, I think that it's not. I'll give them credit, because I think it, as an element of the wider Brexit question, it was one of the really tricky ones, and they managed to sort of keep it within the main negotiation. In the main, I mean, there's still some bits that need sorting. So I'd give them a bit of credit there, but I think it's a great example of the sort of complexities of some of these foreign policy questions.
Yeah, and I mean, it rather underscores the point you made at the beginning, that you really need to have a highly professional bunch of people.
Yeah.
Who actually have the ear of ministers. So it has to be reciprocal. You can't have some sort of dozy character at the top who doesn't listen to anybody because they've got this political thing that they need to do. Which takes me rather straightforwardly into Rwanda. I mean, it's hard to imagine Foreign Office officials recommending what's happening in Rwanda. Quite the reverse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is a great example of a policy that was dreamed up by ministers, and probably with special advisors, but other political advisors, and certainly I think it's a policy that probably started life in the Home Office, and then the Foreign Office is given this problem to implement. And of course, on one level, there are aspects of it that might not be unwelcome for the Foreign Office in a kind of cynical way, because it gives the UK a big presence in Rwanda. Obviously, there's a lot of money that goes with this policy, as we all know. We all as taxpayers have spent hundreds of millions of pounds for the sum total of zero, deportations. So, but clearly, if you're the British High Commissioner in Rwanda, well, that will open a lot of doors for you. Now, I'm not saying that's the reason to do it, but I mean, it gives a great level of sort of complexity and depth to the relationship. But the really much more significant point, and we know this from Foreign Office documents which are in the public domain, is that the Foreign Office has been reporting on the human rights violations committed by the Rwandan government against both its own people and other refugees in Rwanda. And has been reporting on those for some years. So the idea now that we've suddenly decided Rwanda is safe, we've even passed a law which says that Rwanda is safe. I mean, one could pass a law to say that it doesn't rain in Scotland, but we know it will keep raining. I mean, it's.
Well, you could pass a law saying that heroin is safe. I mean,
but right, that's the point. You could pass a law for anything, but it doesn't. It doesn't make any difference to the situation on the ground.
Except it makes everyone involved look really silly.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in Monty Python territory now.
Yeah, I agree.
When you ask me a simple question and I say, but it's that, and you say, so what proof do you have? Well, I just said it's that. Therefore, it must be that.
Yeah, it's an embarrassment. And I think, I mean, there's this whole, the sort of really, I thought, quite distasteful bet between Rishi Sunak and Piers Morgan, £1,000. Will they or will they not deport someone to Rwanda before the election? Well, who knows? Maybe it'll happen, but I would be very surprised, and this is not because the bet's interesting, but the point here about it's you even setting aside the ethical and legal problems with the policy, which are considerable. If you never send anyone to Rwanda anyway, well, it's not a policy. It's just a sort of theoretical fantasy.
Yeah, except, as you say, it costs millions and millions.
Yeah.
I mean, you better off spending it on PR and say.
Yeah.
You also make a very interesting point in your book several times. I'm looking at page 31 now. You're concerned about the ability for hidden money to dominate British politics because of its ramshackle, make it up as you go along system. Are you still concerned about that?
Very much so. And I think so. One of the things I write a bit about in the book is the offshore territories. I mean, we've touched on Gibraltar, and of course, everyone watching this will be familiar that you've got the Channel Islands, you've got Gibraltar, you've got the Isle of Man, and then you've got these places out in the Caribbean, Cayman, BVI, places like that. And these are all they all have slightly different legal status under the Crown, but they're all territories of Britain, but not. They don't have representation. It's they're not just devolved institutions. They're separate, and they are because of the size. Almost the only economic activity that really works for them is this sort of offshore finance model. But that has been responsible for literally billions of dollars of kleptocratic money being laundered. And let's cast our minds back to the invasion of Ukraine in February 22. And there was this sudden sort of rush to sanction all kinds of Russians who had come to this country, bought up the smart properties in London, football clubs. We all know this story. In a way, what was extraordinary was that for roughly 20 years, or sort of the period covered by my book, from the late 90s onwards, Russian money was being welcomed into the UK with open arms, and it was being then laundered through these offshore territories. And throughout that period, if anyone, for example, had said that, if I'd been on this show 3 years ago and said, Roman Abramovich is actually just a front for Putin, the lawyers would have been on to us. Yeah. But everyone knew that was the case. But that was a form of censorship, which again comes from this system of not just money, but lawyers, advisors, all these influential lobbyists, and so on. Now we can say that because he's been sanctioned. He's been forced to release control of Chelsea Football Club. I'm not even aware if he's still in this country now. But the point being that these were big dirty secrets which were sitting there. And it's not just about Russians. There are other foreign kleptocrats who've taken advantage of these systems. And it's partly because, yes, the outsized influence of the City of London. We deindustrialized our economy, so we end up very reliant on these financial services. And we couldn't. Well, I say we couldn't. We chose not to be able to afford to say no to this money. And I give different examples. For example, of the government trying to change the rules around the listing of companies, listing on stock market, so that they could list the Saudi state oil company, Aramco. Now, it didn't happen in the end, but the point was that you had Theresa May and her people telling us Saudis, we'll change the rules for you. It's fine. I mean, what kind of a country under the rule of law is that, when something rather important like the rules for listing the shares of an extremely significant, multi-billion, maybe even trillion-dollar company are something that you can just change to make it easy for them? I mean, that to me is an example of a country that's really lost its way and it's kind of unmoored from its values.
It's interesting. You've got this lovely quote from John le Carre, which rather sums up what you just said. He said, the British Secret Services are microcosms of the British condition, of our social attitudes and vanities. This idea that a country's intelligence services are the truest expression of a nation's character is much quoted, including in my direct experience by British intelligence officers. Applied to the case for war against Iraq, it suggests that Britain is, at the very least, desperate to please, delusional, self-important, and slapdash.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we look at this, the Iraq WMD story, and that's a sort of chapter in the book. And it really, it's I think a lot of people, I was surprised myself that a lot of people have this view that, yes, the WMD was all a mess with Iraq, that the intelligence proved not to be true. But we see that as Bush's war. Blair went along with it, but it was kind of Bush's war. But what I realized when I started sort of looking into this and going through the records, the Chilcot inquiry and various other documents, is that a lot of the more sort of dramatic claims being made by intelligence were actually coming from the British intelligence, from MI6 and other British institutions, and on various occasions, George W. Bush and other senior American officials and leaders, they had to rely on British reports to make the case for the war, because the CIA's own intelligence, they weren't finding this stuff. And again, I quote it in the book, the head of the CIA was saying, well, how come all this stuff is coming from SIS, from MI6? Well, I think the answer, sadly, is that they were prepared in one way or another to produce reporting of questionable veracity. Now, again, this is not me saying the CIA is perfect, or they've got no questions to answer. There are thousands of books about that organization, and lots of people will have their own views. But it was very interesting to me the way that we, as I say, we were desperate to please the Americans, so we kept producing these reports, basically telling them what they wanted to hear. But interestingly, their own people couldn't produce those reports because fundamentally they weren't correct. It wasn't true.
It may well have been, of course, that their system had checks and balances.
Yeah, and I think that's a important point. The American system can be very bureaucratic and slow moving, but I think in some respects it helped with certainly the pre-war intelligence, where there was a lot of kind of wish fulfillment going on, where and I think there was a lazy assumption that if all these reports don't prove to be exactly correct, when we get into Iraq, we'll find piles of these weapons anyway, so it won't really matter. No one will be checking. And of course, they didn't find anything, and that's that proved humiliating, devastating. But of course, fundamentally, you went to war on a false premise, and that's that's a pretty serious thing to have done.
Yeah, mind you, I suspect it's not the first time that's happened.
Definitely not, but a war of choice. There aren't that many. These are quite unusual situations, and I think it's something that I think still affects the Middle East of today. Is profoundly shaped by those events of 2003. Definitely.
Yeah, I didn't want to be flippant, but you make a good point in your book too, that though we should all be concerned about Russia and be concerned about what's happening in Ukraine, but you rather suggest that we ought to be more concerned about China. You feel that Russia is maybe a bit of a spent force in that sense, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's obviously right now in Ukraine, the Russians are on the advance, so we have to be careful how far we take that. But China is a much bigger thing. China is a hugely powerful country. Its economy is more or less same size as the American economy. Will overtake it sooner or later. It's investing enormously in its military, and it's kind of crunching up against what it feels is a world order that doesn't work for it. And of course we could debate that, but if you look, listeners are interested, viewers are interested, look at the maps of the area of the South China Sea that China makes a claim to, and it's hugely, to be polite, hugely ambitious. You might say it's reckless or disgraceful. That they've drawn a big dotted line way down towards sort of Borneo and Malaysia, and said this is all ours. And now they're building these artificial islands and building runways and military bases in the open sea, and they are the only country on earth that could do that. That others might have sort of designs, but they've just got that level of resource. And I think that the challenge is that of course, nobody wants a war with China. I mean, it would probably escalate and be terrifying. But equally, we probably do need to be very careful about whether Chinese tech is hardwired into our communication systems, or whether Chinese surveillance equipment and technology is being used to track people, and those sorts of questions. So I think in a way it's slightly sort of disappointing that we often get distracted by very, very serious events. Clearly, Ukraine's desperately serious, and the events in Gaza, of course, very serious. But there are also some extremely serious questions around China, which perhaps we need to sort of focus more heavily on.
Do you attach any credibility to the notion that's been bandied about that China's in the process of creating a second Silk Road through South America and Africa. And as the US retreats from these areas, China is moving in. You need a hydroelectric dam? No problem. We'll
Yeah.
build it for you. It won't work, but we'll build it for you.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a great question, and yeah. So you have this thing, and some people call it the debt trap diplomacy, because they're lending money, they're building these huge infrastructure projects in African countries, Latin America, and so on, and they're quite often, they'll say it's a sort of it's like one of those great sort of deals where you haven't quite read the small print. You think, oh, this is a brilliant price, and the terms on the loan are perfect, and then actually 6 months later you realize you haven't, that the interest rates have just shot up or whatever, and I don't want to sort of to make it sound too trivial, but that's what has happened. Countries have literally got trapped with huge debt problems that they can't really deal with, and the initial attraction was this kind of no strings attached. So you have this classic thing where Western countries will say, well, we can lend you this money, but there'll be all kinds of conditions, and we'll have inspections, and we'll monitor your elections and all that. And of course, in some cases that's completely appropriate, because after all, if someone wants to borrow money, you can set the terms. But the Chinese way is to claim that there are no strings attached, and then you find the strings are of a different nature. And I think they've been very effective at it. But I think there's a little bit of a pushback now. I think there's at a certain point, some countries have realised that they've got into something that they perhaps didn't want to. So now that doesn't mean I think that means that China's sort of rise is over, because I think it's got a long way to rise. But I think there are a lot of countries that have become perhaps a bit more kind of buyer beware about the sort of China relationship.
You're also slightly troubled by overtures to India. You're concerned that the state there is somewhat authoritarian, perhaps.
Yeah. It's an interesting. I think what's happening in India is something that really people haven't really noticed very much, and it's interesting because obviously India is such a huge, important country, such a significant country. Obviously, very strong links to the UK, both sides of the border. But there is this, the Narendra Modi government of India is profoundly troubling in its sort of extreme Hindu nationalism. Of course, the most recent emanation of this since the book was written, but that people might have seen the reports of this huge Hindu temple that was opened by the Prime Minister. India is, according to its constitution, a secular state, and yet there was once a mosque in this place. The mosque was bulldozed. Various people died in the sort of ensuing riots and massacre. And there's now a vast Hindu temple which has effectively appears to have the sort of the kind of blessing of the country's state. Now, to some extent, getting into religious arguments, it's not for outsiders. But I think what you see is a very troubling type of authoritarianism. I think it's reasonable, in fact, to use the word fascism, because minorities in India, but particularly Sikh and Muslim minorities, are subjected to increasingly severe repression. Remember that you had this assassination in Canada. That was someone who's a Sikh sort of separatist there. You've got sort of gangs meting out violence towards Indian Muslims, of which there are tens of millions, or hundreds of millions, sorry. And so this is not some insignificant group. Now, I don't know where this ends, and it's not for me. I'm not an India expert, but I think we have to be very cautious. And what we're seeing is a lot of countries, because of India's economic potential, cozying up to Prime Minister Modi, Narendra Modi, sort of desperate to sort of invite him to big summits and state visits and those kinds of things. And well, we don't know where this is going to end, but it could end in a very, very ugly place where you have an authoritarian state which is basically destroying certain minority groups. And if you look at the pathway to other authoritarian states in history, a lot of things that we're seeing in India happened in other places. You know, in Germany in the 30s, they were bulldozing synagogues. Now, I'm not saying that that means that it's going to end up in the same place. Of course not. History doesn't have to repeat itself. But I think we have to be very aware and realistic about what is happening there at the moment.
You also make the point that it might be somewhat reciprocal because you say if the entire Indian community in the UK voted Tory, we would see a swing of around 40 seats to the Tories.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, so in the 2019 general election, like the last general election, there was a clear decision made by the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party of Modi, to support the Tories here, and there were WhatsApp groups and sort of messaging and so on that did that for reasons that are slightly interesting. That there's been this sort of sense that the BJP is a kind of naturally sort of conservative right-wing movement, and of course it, you know, populism has landed as the sort of Tory the Tory landing zone, and so in that sense, national populism, it's definitely the same thing. And so this thing of foreign interference, of course, in our politics, now that's something that Britain is very poorly equipped to manage. You know, we don't know what foreign interference happened with Brexit, whether there was foreign interference in 2014. I don't think we know too much about. There was definitely foreign interference in that 2019 election. And I've no doubt there'll be a lot when finally we get the election this year, whenever that might be. And but our electoral commission has very limited resources, can barely keep on top of the current sort of funding systems, and in fact the Tories have made it easier for foreign money to come into our election, which again to me is a very bizarre thing to have done. You can't possibly do that if you want elections to have more integrity. I mean, it just strikes me as a really retrograde step.
Yeah, it seems to be a lot of these problems. We've talked a lot about foreign policy for obvious reasons, but
Yeah.
So much of it seems to come back to the fact that we don't have a sort of adequate constitution that might preclude political parties from playing fast and loose with the electoral system.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that's a great point. I certainly think a written constitution with a sort of very clear set of guardrails. I mean, after all, let's not forget that prorogation of Parliament. That's a classic example of something that you couldn't do that in a country that had a proper constitution, because everyone would know that this was just a sort of stunt, you know. And I think it would also then, it would probably be helpful for the wider questions, the constitutional questions around the union, because then at least we would know the terms by which this union is currently formed and by which it might dissolve itself or evolve, you know, in other ways. I mean, again, the thing of the Brexit referendum, you know, being 50% plus one vote. But it's very unusual for a country to make a major constitutional decision on that referendum basis. Often there are thresholds and you know. Now, whether or not that's the right way to do it is an important question. But that's the point of having a constitution, that you agree collectively what the terms are by which your country is run.
And it seems to me it would also have had a big impact on tonight's vote.
Yes.
Because a constitution would say categorically the speaker
Yes.
can't opt to change the rules. It's not,
yeah,
it's
I
just
agree.
not. You can't do
I
these
agree.
things.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
It's and in a way, because again the problem with our current system is that because the rules aren't clear. Yes, he's broken with convention, but then, you know, what is convention?
Precisely.
He can put forward his argument, and the SNP has every right to say, well, this is our opposition day, and you basically pulled the rug from under our feet. And as you say, if there was a constitution, then you wouldn't have this absurd situation where a man who was elected as a Labour MP, and definitely, you know, apparently he had a meeting today with Keir Starmer and Sue Gray. Now, obviously, I wasn't in the room. I don't know that there may have been no pressure brought to bear on him, but there are reports that he was put under pressure.
But you would like to think he would be a bit like Caesar's wife and not have these meetings at this time. Let's do it tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, it seems very poor judgment. And what's odd is, I think, you know, people who've looked at his performance over several months, I don't think he's been very partisan up to this point, but he certainly has made a mess of this one. And I think, you know, it will undermine his credibility for the future.
Well, we've almost run out of time, Arthur. Thanks very much. We set out to inform, educate, and entertain. I think we've covered all of these bases tonight. People are saying absolutely fascinating conversation. Well done, Arthur.
Well, thank you. It's been a huge pleasure. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you again. And if you want to use this recording, it's on YouTube, so feel free.
Brilliant.
Thanks again, Arthur.
Share widely.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. So there we are, folks. Another terrific show. I think you'll agree. It's very rare that we hear from a foreign policy expert. I mean, in fact, I don't recall a conversation of this length with anyone who was able to talk in the way that Arthur has. So a big thank you to him. A big thank you to all of you for watching us tonight and joining in the show. Thanks for your comments and questions. We've tried to take as many as we can. Happily, Arthur was able to anticipate a number of the points that you've raised, which is great. Look out for next week's show because we'll have another formidable guest coming up. And to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe and take care. Good night.